So Guru Ben and myself will animate this class on the Malay Keris, and we're gonna start with the specificities of the Keris. We discussed it briefly last week when we talked about the Sundan. For those who weren't here, we're gonna just briefly go ahead and talk about it again. So basically, if you remember from last week, the Keris is a very specific blade with very specific characteristics, and whether it's a big Sundan Filipino Keris primary weapon for slashing, or an Indonesian Keris, a Javanese Keris in this particular case, which is a secondary weapon and mainly used for stabbing, so it has completely different tactical purposes, but the characteristic of what makes a Keris are still there. Number one, the blade is asymmetrical, whether it's wavy or straight. I'm going to show you a straight blade later on. You have an asymmetrical part here with a bigger pieces here, and that will tell you how to hold the Keris when you use it in order not to stab yourself with this little part here. You have a little extra piece here. If it's pre-Islam, it looks like an elephant trunk. If it's post-Islam, it will be more of a square, but you always have this little prominent part here. And it's made of two pieces of steel. So if you remember, we talked about this piece here. If you follow my finger, this is a separate piece of steel, which is just put together when you assemble the Keris on the handle. But this here, this part here, is a separate piece of metal from that part here. So those are what makes the Keris a Keris. After that, you have wavy Kerises, straight Kerises, semi-wavy and straight Kerises, etc., etc. One of the ways to immediately tell where a Keris is from is to look at the shield. So you look at the piece here, what we call the boat, and you know immediately that this and this are Javanese Kerises. If you look at the Bugis, it's a little different. It's a little bit more square in its angles, and that's really typical of the Bugis Keris. So that's the first thing that you look when you look at a Keris. You look at the whole thing without taking the blade out, and you know immediately from which island it is from. Is it from Indonesia? Is it from Malaysia? Is it from Brunei? Is it from Borneo? Is it from Thailand? Is it from the Philippines? So just at looking at it from the outside, you immediately know where it's from. Again, let's start with the Javanese. Ben, those two here are Javanese Kerises. This one is a black blade, very beautiful piece, and straight, as you can see, but the characteristics are still there. The blade is asymmetrical. You have the elephant trunk here, as those one are older. It's a separate piece of metal here and there. And of course, this one is straight compared to that one, which is a wavy blade. If you have a Keris which is symmetrical or with an even number of parallel knots, it's not a Keris. It's a modern copy. Sometimes they even call it a Keris, but it's not a Keris. So back to the Bugis again. Here is another great example. You can recognize again the square angle here on the shield. The pistol grip is even more accentuated than the Javanese, and the reason is the Bugis were the warriors of the Indonesian, especially Majapahit Empire. So here you can really see the practicality of the Bugis Keris. It's very rare that a Bugis Keris will have a very nice pamor or very ornamental. This one is an exception. I will show you the pamor a little bit later, where the Javanese, even though practical, was more of a status weapon. You look at this one, it has some nice gold engraved in it. The pamor is absolutely amazing. I will come a little closer later, where the Bugis is really simply for stabbing. Okay? You can see also, once you have the pistol grip in your hand, like Ben said, you have a little hole here, a little opening to put your thumb, which will stabilize the way you hold the Keris and move. One other thing that is interesting with the Keris is it's not a right-handed or left-handed weapon. It can be both. So here you have the kris mounted for a right-handed person. So you hold the pistol grip like this and you put your thumb onto the blade here. But if I was to fight like a lefty, I would just simply turn this part here completely and hold it like this, put my thumb here and use it as a lefty. So the handle, even though it's quite solid and you can fight with it without losing the blade, but it moves to adapt from a lefty to a righty. Same thing with the Javanese. Here I put my thumb in here, which tells me exactly how it's supposed to be used. Here for a righty, and if I switch completely, turn my handle all the way, now it's made for a lefty. So here on the boogies, you can see that the Parkour is very nice. You have different waves and pattern inside, which again is the signature of the smith and tells you a lot about how the steel was bent and forged. So it's very interesting when you're a collector to recognize the different kind of Parkour. Like Guru Ben said, there are more than 50 styles of Parkour. This is a very nice piece of Javanese kris. You can see also a very nice Parkour with two colors, a light gray and a very dark, almost black gray. And here you have the golden leaves at the bottom that goes all the way to the second piece of metal. And here a quite interesting black only straight blade kris. This one is lilas. That's a pure Javanese kris. As you can see also, the handle sometimes is carved to give it a little bit more of a design. And here on this one, you can really see this little opening here to put the thumb into it. You don't always see it on the gray blades, but on the black blade, you can really see it. And this is where I put my thumb to stabilize the blade as I stab. As we discussed last week, the Filipino kris, the sundown, is a kris. It has all the characteristics of a kris that you could find in Java or in other islands in the Malay Peninsula. But one thing that is interesting is the Filipino kris, the sundown, is a war weapon, a war and battlefield weapon. It is a non-status weapon. It has nothing to do with who you are in the tribe. If you can afford a steel blade, you'll have a kris. And it is a slashing weapon and a primary weapon. The Indonesian kris, as well as the Malay krises, is the complete opposite. It's a status weapon first. It's a stabbing weapon and not slashing. It's a secondary weapon. It's not something you would go to war with. And finally, it's more the size of a dagger, where the Filipino kris is more of the size of a small blade, a small sword. So what's interesting is they have the same blade characteristics, but they are on the opposite spectrum of a tactical weapon. One is for slashing and a primary weapon, when the other one is for stabbing and a secondary weapon. The Javanese kris would be worn here in the front. Okay. Again, as a sign of status, you want your weapon to be seen. You don't want to hide it. Okay. So because it's a way to show the people around you how high elevated you are in the clan's hierarchy, you want everybody to be able to see the kris. So the Javanese kris, being primary a status weapon, it would be held here in the front. Okay. Your slash or your sarong would stop here. You would insert it, put it here in there, and that's how you would wear it. If I come a little closer, you can see that if I have a slash here, you can really see the beauty of the kris. You can see its characteristic. If this is a precious handle, like maybe ivory or precious wood, everybody would see it, which is basically the goal of a status weapon. Okay. The way it would be used is the moment you need to take it off, you would step back with that leg in order to clear the path for a stabbing motion. So for us in Kali, it's typical of an angle 5. And as you know, if you take off your blade to give an angle 5 and you don't step back, you have to go toward the opponent as you draw. And doing this, you may very well be intercepted, be cut in a largo mano kind of way. So if I do this and I go toward the opponent, I could get cut and lose my weapon. This is why when the primary tactics of your weapon is the stabbing motion, is an angle 5, you need to step away with that leg. If you're already there, you would step a little bit further. If you're this leg forward, you would completely step off here in order to draw backward instead of forward. And from there, you will stab here, or you will step forward and stab there. Now, if we look at the boogies, Chris, it's a little different. And this is just because of who the boogies warriors were. Because they were purely fighters and they didn't really care about status, the weapon was worn completely differently. So the boogies Keris would be most of the time wore behind. So the Keris would be worn here behind, again, into the slash or into the sarong. And of course, when the blade is behind, you don't need to step backward to draw. You will draw here on the side, okay? So let me do that a little closer to the camera, okay? The Keris would be worn here behind. I would just grab the pistol grip, exactly like the Japanese. I would put my thumb here, ready as I draw, ready to end up in the hole, the little hole here that is made for securing my thumb and my grip. Okay. So one more time, I'll be here. I will step directly with it. So you see, the footwork is very different. Even though the blade looks almost exactly the same, the footwork is different, and yet the stabbing is still an angle 5. And this is just because of where the Keris is worn. This is much faster. I don't need to step back to come back in. I'm here, I'm walking, or I'm fighting, or whatever, and I just need to get in and stab. It's much faster. I have less little steps to do, and it's much easier from a fighting perspective, from a fighting point of view. I told you before that the Indonesian Keris is mostly a stabbing weapon, where the Filipino Keris is mostly a slashing weapon. It doesn't mean that you can't stab with a Filipino Keris occasionally. We talked about it and demonstrated it last week. And same thing with the Malay Keris. It doesn't mean, it's not because it's a stabbing weapon primarily that you can't slash somehow. You can't make big slashes. It doesn't make any sense. The handle is absolutely not built for that. This, even though it cuts a little bit, it's a little sharp, but not enough to cut through a body, absolutely not. But you can use this little tip here to make mini slashes and to cut, almost like a gunting in Kali. So it's very interesting to understand how this works. And if the tip is poisoned, of course, I can stab, but I can also, as the weapon comes to me, I can also almost like fencing. I can cut and parry and get ready to stab again. So it's something that we find also in the Filipino martial arts. When you parry and come back, okay, someone is stabbing me and go 5, I will parry out, boom, hit to the face and come back. Something quite similar.